Well, hello there, listeners. It's Suzi New from the Australian Society of Anaesthetists here, and thank you for listening to, drumroll please, the 100th episode of the Australian Anaesthesia podcast. And I don't know if you know, but in the podcasting world, making it to your 100th episode is a huge milestone. So what are we going to talk about in this episode? Well, I thought we'd go through some of the questions that I often get asked about the podcast. Like, what on earth made me start making it? What are my favourite episodes? Which ones do other people like? Yes, this is an indulgent reflection on the podcast, and what better time to do it than our 100th episode? So perhaps like you and many other people I've talked to, I didn't really like the sound of my voice, and I certainly didn't wake up one morning and say, I want to make a podcast. Actually, now that I think of it, I know a few of you out there have woken up with that idea and even reached out to me for some podcasting tips. Thank you for doing that. All I can say is great for you. Go for it. The world needs you to make some noise. Anyway, back to the origins of this podcast. It all started back in 2018, actually, when I was the vice president of the ASA, or coming into being the vice president. I had already been sitting around the ASA board table for about 4 years by then, and I was impressed by the calibre of the discussions behind some of the decisions that were being made. As with many organisations, there was a lot of thought and nuanced points being made. And I thought, all of that happens here around this board or this council table, and all that members hear is the final decision. They're not privy to the deliberations that went on behind the scenes. So I was talking about this issue with Dr David Tian, who was the president of the New Zealand Society of Anaesthetists at the time. And he shared with me that he'd had similar ideas, and he told me that he had actually started writing a president's blog for the NZSA members. And I thought that was a really good idea. I'll do the same. What's that line about imitation being the best form of flattery? Anyway, so he even shared with me some of his writing at the time so that I could get an idea of what it sounded like, how to do it, so that I could prepare myself really. But unfortunately, apart from that, I didn't actually do much in terms of preparing myself for how to write a blog. And that's because a few months later, I became the president, and it really took all of my focus and energy to navigate that transition. I had in the interim mentioned it to our IT team, and our IT manager at the time, Paul Singh, really supported the idea and was talking about it with me. He was offering to build a webpage for it, and he's had all these questions like, who will it be for? Will it just be for ASA members? Will it be for the public? How often was I going to write? How are we going to, make the page look? And you get the idea. And I hadn't really thought about any of those questions because I was sitting there trying to write my blog post. While I was writing it, I wanted to sound intelligent. I wanted it to be profound. I wanted to also be a bit funny. All these things that I wanted for it. And all I was really faced with was a blank Word document. After some gentle inquiries from Paul, I eventually confessed. And I said, look, I really have no idea what to write. And so he came back to me with what has since become some life-changing words, which were, why don't you make a podcast? Just hold the phone to your mouth and press record. As you can imagine, I was a bit shocked. But the idea kind of grew on me. And then I think it was during one of our meetings, Dr Mark Sinclair, who was chair of the Economics Advisory Committee at the time, he's now the president, by the way. Anyway, he and I were talking and he was giving us updates about the RVG and how it's organised. And I thought this would make a really good topic for a podcast. We could explain how the RVG works, just like he was explaining it to me in the committee now. By the way, if you don't know what the RVG is, it stands for the Relative Value Guide. It's how anaesthetists calculate their fees. There was a time when anaesthetists used to just pluck out a number and that's what they would charge. So now we have a system that's the RVG, and that's what we base our fees on. And they're based on the complexity of the surgery and the patient and so forth. So it's a much fairer system all around. Anyway, I digress. So I asked Mark, and thankfully he said yes. What ended up happening is we stayed behind after a board meeting, and I plonked the computer right in between the middle of us and pressed record. There was no microphones. We're just in the boardroom. There's no sophisticated audio studio. In fact, there was very, very minimal editing. When I say minimal, I only edited the audio once. And that is when the lovely Sue Donovan, who's the executive assistant to the CEO, walked in to see if we were okay. So that's it. That was our first podcast episode. Here's an excerpt of it here. You can check out the sound quality for yourself. We are recording a podcast. I've got with me today Dr Mark Sinclair, who's chair of the Economics Advisory Committee. So, Mark, maybe do you want to start with introducing yourself first of all?
Yeah, thanks very much, Suzi, and greetings to everybody listening.
So it always humbles me when I hear sound quality. But despite it, you can still find that original episode on the ASA website. So why haven't I removed it or remastered the episode? Well, because people are still listening to it. And it reinforces to me, people come for the content. I mean, sure, I love listening to good sound quality as much as the next avid podcast listener. And I think it's a lovely, humbling reminder to myself of how far the team have come in terms of producing a podcast. Because back then I really had this ethos that I just really wanted it to be very minimal, very low tech. I was even holding out. It's like, I don't even want to have a microphone. I just want to be able to record on the run with very, very little specialist equipment. And I still kind of have that attitude now. But what's changed? Obviously, I hope you will appreciate that the sound quality has improved over the course of the podcast. But what I think really made a big difference in terms of the podcast was that I attended a course that was developed and hosted by Seth Godin, who is a marketer. I'll put a link to his book in the show notes in case you're interested. Anyway, the course was great. It had us doing voice work, developing cover art, learning how to use podcast hosting platforms, all those things that you need to put a podcast together and out to the world. And that's when I caved and finally bought a microphone and just started upping my production game. So definitely the best part of that course was being part of a really supportive group of people willing to listen to each other's work, provide feedback, to grow and learn together. Amazing group. And some key players from that group, we still actually catch up. It just shows you what a lovely community was built. So thanks, Steve, Craig, Jay, you know who you are. I think part of what brought this group together was that it was 2020. And need I remind you, we were at the start of the pandemic. So, so much uncertainty. We were in lockdowns. And I think so many people, not just for me, just took up podcasting at that stage because kind of had very little else to do, except, I actually had a lot of stuff to do. Anyway, also at that time, I was meeting with the presidents of the Anaesthesia societies of the Common Interest Group. So that's the American ASA, Canada, UK, South Africa, New Zealand. And we were learning about how COVID was impacting them and what they were doing. I was learning so much about respiratory protection, about airborne transmission, infection control, not even just from anaesthesia societies in other countries, but from other industries. And I could see that we in healthcare in Australia were just so unprotected. And I wanted to share what I had learnt, what I'd been learning with people, but I just didn't have the time to write it all down, prepare an email, formalise it into guidelines, policies, all that sort of stuff that goes on in the background of what a society does. So I took up podcasting and sharing the information that way. It's no surprise that the first 15 episodes or so of this podcast are all to do with COVID. In those episodes, I talk about respiratory protection, fit testing. This was new to us, to anaesthetists in Australia at the time. In fact, not just anaesthetists, but many, many people in healthcare in Australia at the time. And I hope these terms are common to you now. In fact, preparing for this episode has reminded me to book in for my annual fit test. So that is done. Thank you. But anyway, I like an example of that. I love this example is this episode I do with Kate Cole, who is an occupational. Why don't you have a listen to how I pronounce her profession? Thank you so much for making this time to speak with me this morning.
Oh, you're welcome.
You're an occupational hygienist, is that right?
I am, yes.
And have I said that right?
You have.
Okay, good.
That leads me to believe that you have never heard that term before, potentially. Is that right?
If anyone spent any time in North America, you might have picked up that I actually pronounced it with a North American pronunciation, which goes to show that I was hearing more about occupational hygienists from my North American colleagues than I was from anyone here in Australia. Anyway, those episodes, if you're ever listening to them, they're interesting from a historical point of view. They're still on the ASA website. I don't know how much longer we'll keep them there. It's probably time to move that content on, but that's another thing that can sit on the to-do list for a while. Those episodes were made in the days before I knew how to publish a podcast publicly. And they very much served as a way for me as president back then to communicate with members during a time of so much uncertainty and change. And I really, really thank all the members who were there at the start of this podcast. There was Brian Spain, Phil Bloom, Dan Holmes, Stu Marshall, Santa Robertson, Ange Baker. So many people. I won't go through them all. But anyway, thank you. Thank you, all of you, for lending us your voices, particularly during the start of the pandemic when, for some people there wasn't enough information, for some people there was too much information, and it was really helpful to help navigate it all. There was one COVID episode that I did publish, and that in fact went on to become one of the most popular episodes of the Australian Anaesthesia podcast for a very, very long time. And I even heard some of my words being used by a radio journalist. That's the episode I did with Dr Ryan Salter. He is an anaesthetist and intensivist who spent a year in a COVID ECMO centre in the UK. For those of you who don't know, ECMO is extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. It's basically either a lung or heart-lung bypass machine. It's like full-on life support. He was there before coming back to New Zealand, and it's just mind-blowing going back and listening to that episode and thinking about the sheer volume of critically unwell people that he cared for.
To provide some context, Papworth is normally funded to around about 34, 35 ICU beds, and we've more than doubled capacity. So I think we went up to a total of 80 ICU-level patients, all of whom were either ventilated or on ECMO across several different locations in the hospital.
You know, how he came back to New Zealand, which was basically COVID zero. Like there was no pandemic over there from, you know, what people tell me. Anyway, I hope he navigated that transition well. And thank you, Ryan, for lending your voice to this podcast at the time. This is another excerpt from that episode with Dr. Ryan Salter. There's nothing like that first-hand experience of the impact of this pandemic on staff at the time.
As it became apparent that there was going to be at least some kind of third wave within the NHS, there were a number of very senior, very skilled ICU nursing staff at the hospital who decided to resign.
I've included that excerpt there because, you know, although we didn't have the numbers, I was still as in that role as president hearing from anaesthetists all around the country. I really became aware of the toll that the pandemic was having on the well-being of anaesthetists. So I delved into a well-being focused series of episodes. We talked about burnout with Dr Amy Imms, that's in episode 59. There was supervision with Drs Renee Franklin and Melanie Johns in episode 54. There was a whole bunch of trainee-focused episodes. At the time, you know, trainees were having their training being interrupted. Some were worried about passing exams. So I chatted with Professor David Story, who's the current college president, about his experience of not passing his exam. That's in episode 64. And there are all the other stresses on top of the pandemic, the usual life events like having family. So I delved into pregnancy, taking time off work, returning to work in episodes 26, 28 and 29 with Drs Cara Allen, Jeanette Wright, Rosamund Zackers, Isabel Cooper, Georgie Cameron, Anna Peach and Amelia Reese. You know, so many people contributed to this series, and apologies if I don't mention you all here. I think the episode, though, that had the biggest impact on me was my conversation with Dr Colin Baird. And, well, let him explain it to you in his words.
I was in a vulnerable position looking back, in that I was susceptible to making bad choices and risk-taking behaviour. And I was working as an anaesthetist, and I could see the effect that fentanyl had on my patients. And I began to fantasize about using it. It was something that just began to go around my mind. And once I started to look, I noticed just how many opportunities there were in the whole process between signing it out and giving it to the patient and then afterwards, how many opportunities there were for diversion. It seemed glaringly obvious to me that this was something that could be done. And then one day it happened. I slipped a syringe into my pocket and I was incredibly nervous and anxious and thought, well, I'm going to be caught. But I wasn't. And being an anaesthetist, we are trained to give IV drugs, and it was actually remarkably easy to self-administer. And it really was as simple as that. I mean, crossing that line happened. And once it had happened, I couldn't go back.
That's from episode 33, by the way. And my ethos back then with the podcast, and still now, was that I'm not really into chasing download numbers, clicks, views, whatever metrics the platforms decide to feed us. I think that if a podcast, particularly one of those ones from the Wellbeing series, helps out one person, then it was definitely worth making that podcast. And from that conversation with Dr. Colin Baird, I received so much positive feedback. So really, thanks, Colin, for your openness in sharing your experience, time and voice with me. So if you want to find those episodes, by the way, they're on a playlist on the Wellbeing Special Interest Group page, which of course I'll put a link to in the show notes. The other playlist that I've had great feedback about is the Leadership Collection, which can be found on the Leadership and Management SIG page. I once did a leadership workshop, and the host said at the start that once you finish your qualification, whatever field it is that you train in, be it accounting or engineering or in our case anaesthesia, most of your career development after that is in leadership. And I reckon I agree. So sure, since I fellowed, I've had to learn new medications, new anaesthesia techniques, but I've had to learn a lot more about leadership. You know, the art of how to get stuff done, bringing people with me. You know, to me, the basic building blocks of learning leadership are, number one, you've got to learn about yourself, how you think, how you process information, how you consider what's important. And then after that, how to communicate with the people you work with, those you lead, how to manage team dynamics, negotiation, conflict. And then moving to an even broader context, understanding the organisational, political, etc. environment in which you work and strategic thinking, finances, if that's part of your role. And then finally, mentoring, building a future generation of great leaders. You sort of get to this point in leadership when you realise that's what it's really about. Anyway, all of these ideas are covered in these leadership podcasts. Sometimes it's just good to hear from leaders in our field just to learn how they got to where they are now, how they made something happen. And I was really fortunate during my time as president because there were almost everywhere I looked other women in leadership roles. There was a woman who was president of the New Zealand Society. There was a CEO who was a woman in the South African Society. Even the Association of Anaesthetists of Great Britain and Ireland had their first ever female president, who was Kathleen Ferguson, and our terms overlapped. I was really fortunate and thankful that through the podcast I could share some of their experiences. And one that really, really stays in my mind is my conversation with Jannicke Mellin-Olsen, who was the president of the World Federation of Societies of Anaesthesiologists. On the day we were recording our podcast, it just happened to be the day that her brother would have turned 60. And that was a really significant milestone for her, which I'll let her explain it in her words.
It's funny you are mentioning this today because this is today 60 years since my brother was born.
Oh, wow.
So that's interesting because I had a brother who was born when I was 3.5 years. So now you can directly calculate my age. But he was born with esophagus atresia and some other malformations. And my mother knew that if she was not with him in the hospital, he would not survive. And I told my mother, okay, you go and look after Torgrim in the hospital and I will take care of my sister who was 2 at the time. And she had no choice. So she was there with him and I looked after my sister. And then 6 months later, there was a medical error that happened and he died even though she was with him because he was operated and there was a surgeon who had said, do not remove his tube in the ventricle, the gastric ventricle. So they removed it, put it back into the peritoneal cavity, and he was fed through that tube, and then he died. So after that, my childhood was over because I stopped playing. And this was my mother's bad conscience. But I knew she was a desperate mother. She did what she had to do. Nobody else wanted to help her. And sometimes mothers have to make those choices. But then after that, I decided I want to do something in this world, make it a better place.
And Jannicke definitely made this world a better place. She, through her hard work, her advocacy, through the WFSA and various other organisations on quality and safety, she's left an incredible legacy. And for those who don't know, Jannicke sadly passed away earlier this year. She was an incredibly strong woman right until the very end. And even the last day of her term as president was spent in the most unconventional manner. But your last day as president, can I ask how you spent that?
Well, I spent that being a patient in the operating theatre. It was so nice because it was in the National Hospital of Norway and some of my former residents had put syringe labels and made a very nice chart to say, "Hey, Jannicke," and "get well soon," and so on. And they had taped it to the operating lamp. So the last thing I saw before I fell asleep was this very nice thing that my former residents had made to make me feel safe because they removed most of my pancreas and my spleen on my last day of president.
I'll leave you to listen to the rest of the episode as to how that impacted her presidency. As I said, incredible woman, strong woman. And I chat with her in episode 41. And yeah, we miss you, Jannicke. Anyway, speaking of leadership, a big change for the podcast was when my term as president came to an end and it was time to hand over. And I was really cognizant that I didn't want to keep podcasting as the ASA president. I simply couldn't. I was no longer the president. I was very happy to hand that on. And so I shifted the focus of the podcast because I really wanted to showcase some of the incredible work that you, the anaesthetists of Australia, do out there. And so with that change in mindset came some new music. I moved from the let's keep calm during the pandemic kind of music to one that was composed and recorded by one of our very own ASA members with the brief that I wanted something a bit more upbeat and that represented anaesthesia. He did a great job, don't you think? So with the new music, the new focus of the podcast, what have been some of my favourite episodes? After all the hours that I've spent recording, editing, re-listening to every episode, that to me is a bit like asking a parent to choose their favourite child. They're all special to me. One series that I have really enjoyed making is the Theatre Lights On, as in like, let's put the spotlight on somewhere. And that was an opportunity to shine a spotlight on a different part of Australia by talking with the anaesthetists that work there. Maybe it's because I like to travel, or maybe it's because I like trying to learn more about what it's like to walk in other people's shoes. Like in this conversation with Dr David Tian about his time in Antarctica, his description of reverse culture shock still brings up vivid images for me.
After spending 10 months there, we sailed back into Hobart, and coming through the Hobart sort of a harbour, the smell of the eucalyptus really hits you, and the colour green really hits you because we didn't really have any new smells for the year. We didn't really see the colour green for the year as well. One
of the things I dabbled with in terms of learning about podcasting is storytelling. I still have a lot to learn about this, but I love this conversation with Dr David Borshoff about the Anaesthesia Crisis Manual that he wrote. That's in episode 25. You know, as we were chatting, I could just hear this wonderful story being rolled out that just magically fell into place. It came full circle. All the bits just landed. That is, I think, more testament to David's storytelling ability than mine. But I think it all started with this question that I asked him. I think there's still something more in there because many of us have been involved in resuscitations, but many of us don't go on and write a manual that helps everyone else.
When you say there's more involved, I don't know exactly what the trigger was other than the patient was part of the process. I mean, the human side of this story is that the patient was an American visitor. And I'm going to tell this story, Suzi, and you can edit it down, but I'm just going to share it with you anyway, because it was probably the most significant event of my career. So I'm going to just share it.
And I think the other part of it was that we had this very candid conversation, which I have edited out, which partly came from the fact that David and I know each other from his time as chair of the communications committee. And I think podcasting is really good at building and capturing some of that intimacy. You know, you can express thoughts, what I call the grey zone. That's the things that are just ideas perhaps. You know, they're not strong enough to be made into black and white, into a policy, into a guideline. But you just can dive a bit deeper into some of these nuanced discussions, which reminds me of another person that I have known for a long time since my days at medical school, and that is Dr Ben McKenzie. Our conversation is one where, unlike my one with David's, is I admit I held back. I found this topic so hard to speak about. I found it really hard to chat with Ben and ask him deep questions, diving questions. I was just, you know, he's an emergency physician. He lost his son to anaphylaxis. Not only there, but he was there at the resuscitation of his son.
I'm in Port Melbourne and it's quite a drive to the hospital, and Max is on the way to hospital and he's become unconscious and peri-arrest and and they arrived there within minutes, but yet I'm the one that ended up having to facilitate a number of interventions that were life-saving but too late.
Just thinking about it still saddens and shocks me now. That was episode number 78, by the way. You know, that episode was a bit controversial. Some people didn't like that episode going out, and I'll let you listen to it and make up your own mind if you haven't already. I've had to go back and listen to it in order to prepare this episode, and I always find it hard. I'm still glad we published it though. Still very glad. And in looking it up actually for this episode, I've just looked at the stats. As I mentioned, I don't routinely follow them, but I've just looked them up. That is the one episode of the whole Australian Anaesthesia podcast that has been downloaded the most number of times. So there you go. That's as of today. Anyway, speaking of stats, actually, while we're talking about it, I had a look at the ASA's YouTube channel, just out of interest, and the podcast episode that outperforms the others is episode 50. In that episode, I'm the one being interviewed, had the microphone table turned, so to speak. I'm being interviewed by a lovely high school student. Her name is Chow. And she reached out to me because she wanted to find out what is involved in becoming an anaesthetist.
So just moving on to tips for, aspiring anaesthetists, what should we do in high school to prepare?
She does a great job. I think if students out there like Chow are interested in pursuing a career in anaesthesia, then I think the future of our specialty is looking really bright. As I said, this is the top performing episode on YouTube. I think it's definitely the content. It's certainly not the guest, me, which makes this podcast so popular. And likewise, episode 70, where I chat with Dr Amritha on her path to becoming a specialist here in Australia after first qualifying in India. I think if these episodes are anything to go by, there is a lot of interest in our specialty, which we know, right? It's super competitive to get in. And who can blame them? I mean, I think we truly are an amazing, great branch of medicine. There are heaps of wonderful, skilled, compassionate, kind, talented anaesthetists in Australia. And I suspect you listening to this podcast, I suspect you're one of them. And I hope that I can keep bringing their voice, your voice, ideas, experiences back to you. I think what really brings people to work with the ASA, like staff, the leadership team, the many, many committee members who volunteer our time, is that we really want to have a role in supporting, educating and representing the anaesthetists of Australia. And I'll keep continuing to do that through this podcast and the various other video and print publications that I oversee. There'll be more episodes in the Talking Money series where we go through some of the tips and tricks to help you manage your practice, be it in private or in public. There'll be more educational content, more content from webinars. There'll be more series like the one I did with Richard Scalero on anaphylaxis. I'll still be looking into the innovators amongst us and how they juggle their side hustles or how they channel their creative work in anaesthesia. There'll also be more well-being focused episodes coming out. Lots of conversations in the pipeline that, as I said before, are designed to support you in your work, in your practice, be of educational value. I have to warn you though, maybe, that I've sat on some more controversial ideas over the years. And I think it's time to give them some voice too. As I said, they might be controversial, and I think that just comes with the territory of when you speak up. Some people will love your ideas, some won't. So some of the future episodes of this podcast might inspire you. They may well just challenge you. It's likely they'll challenge me too. Let's just see what happens, or as my daughter would say, dun, dun, dun. Okay. There is definitely better music around. But before I sign off, I want to say a huge, huge, huge thank you to you for listening, for supporting this podcast, encouraging me to keep going. Thank you. I seriously would not do it if it weren't for you. Thank you also to all the wonderful guests over the years who've contributed their voices. I have loved every conversation that we have had. And again, I couldn't do it without the guests who are willing to stand up and speak. Thank you, thank you. And I really want to thank the podcast community all around the world, a supportive group of people, as well as the ASA, the leadership team, the management team. Thank you for your support of the podcast. As they say, we'll be back to regular programming with the next episode. I hope you've really enjoyed this special 100th episode of the Australian Anaesthesia podcast. Until the next one, I hope you're staying safe and well out there.
This has been Australian Anaesthesia, produced by the Australian Society of Anaesthetists, with many thanks to host and editor Dr Suzi, with music by Soda Lime Music, sound and engineering by Bearview, and graphics by the ASA Communications team. For more content, please visit www.asa.org.au.